Hello, good evening, and welcome to another virtual event from the Norwich Bookstore. And whether you're joining us from the Upper Valley of Vermont, New Hampshire, from Norwich itself, or from further afield around the country, or even around the world, I am so glad to welcome you here tonight. My name is Sam. I am one of the owners, along with my partner Emma, of the Norwich Bookstore. We're located in Norwich, Vermont, right there on Main Street. And so if you're in the area, we hope you'll stop by sometime soon. We are open for browsing now. And we are so delighted to be here tonight, celebrating the release of a book that we've been very excited about for some time, The Real Valkyrie. Before we get started, I have just a couple of announcements to make. First of all, we are doing a full schedule of these virtual events right now. We certainly had hoped to return to in-person events in the fall, but that's looking like proceeding with caution is the best thing to do right now. So we are continuing with virtual events, and we have a full schedule up on our website. That's norwichbookstore.com. You can also sign up for our email newsletter. There, you can follow us on social media. We're at Norwich Bookstore on most of the major platforms. That way you can keep up to date with what we have coming up. And I am sure that there will be some other events throughout the fall and winter that will be of interest to you. So we encourage you to check them out. Now, about those books, we are here tonight celebrating The Real Valkyrie. It's the new book by Nancy Marie Brown. It's a dirty secret in this business, this business of books, that you can't read them all, and you certainly can't love them all. But The Real Valkyrie is one that I personally devoured over the course of about a week. It's a wonderful book. I am very excited to be introducing it tonight. And I think if you are a lover of Norse history, of untold stories, of the sagas, you're also going to enjoy this. So in the chat to books that you can purchase, and one of them, of course, will be The Real Valkyrie. We'll also have links to some of Nancy's other books, to Shelley Puhak's forthcoming book. And I encourage you to click those links, order the books, and we are happy to ship them to you anywhere in the country that you may be, or if you are here in the Norwich area, we can have them available for pickup at the store or on the porch, contactless porch pickup. And no matter which way you choose to purchase your book, we really appreciate your support of the Norwich Bookstore. That's what keeps us going. It's what's kept us going through these challenging 18 months, and it's what will keep us going and keep allowing us to host author events like this for a long time to come. So thank you so much for your support. Now, tonight we're going to speak for a little while. Nancy and Shelley are going to talk about Real Valkyrie. We're going to do a little reading, and then we are going to take questions. So if you have questions throughout the event, if you think of a question, you can post it in the chat in the sidebar, or at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A module, and you can type your question in there. I will come back on screen at the end and moderate the Q&A, and we'll get to as many questions as we have time for. So I encourage you, as you think of questions, as you think of things you want to hear elaborated on, type them in the chat, type them in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the evening. And now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome two authors I'm very excited to hear in conversation tonight. Tonight we're here with Nancy Marie Brown. She is the author of several highly acclaimed works of nonfiction. Those include Ivory Vikings and Song of the Vikings. These books have been reviewed in the New Yorker and the New York Times, The Economist, among many other places. She spent decades studying Icelandic culture and literature, and she lives here in Vermont, where she keeps Icelandic horses, 4 of them at last count, and Icelandic sheepdogs. And her new book is The Real Valkyrie. Joining Nancy in conversation tonight is Shelley Puhak. She's a writer whose work engages with history in unexpected ways, which, as you'll see, makes her perfect for tonight's conversation. Her prose has appeared in The Atlantic, in creative nonfiction, in the Virginia Quarterly Review, and in other publications. She's been anthologized in Best American Travel Writing, and she received distinctive designations, notable designations, in Best American Essays 2016 through 2019 editions. She is the author of several acclaimed collections of poetry, and her nonfiction debut, The Dark Queens, is forthcoming in February of 2022. And I will post a link in the chat to pre-order that book as well. Please, from wherever you're joining us tonight, join me in giving a warm welcome to Shelley Puhak and Nancy Marie Brown. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sam, for that wonderful introduction.
So excited to be here, Nancy. And this is just such a paradigm shifting book. I can't wait to dig in. I know you were going to give us a treat and read us a little bit from the introduction to start things off.
Yeah, that's what I have planned. This is the first page of the book. The introduction is called The Valkyrie's Grave. So here's how it begins. All I have are her bones. I don't know her name or precisely where or when she was born. I don't know how she died, though bones often do betray such secrets. All I have are her bones, now boxed and stored in a museum in Sweden. Bones gathered by an archaeologist in 1878 from a grave beside a hill fort overlooking the Viking town of Birka, where she was buried in the mid-10th century in a spacious, wood-lined pit. To tell her story, all I have are her bones and what was unearthed with her. An axe blade, 2 spearheads, a 2-edged sword, a clutch of arrows, their shafts embellished with silver thread, a long sax knife in a bronze-ringed sheath, iron bosses for 2 round shields, a short-bladed knife, a whetstone, a set of game pieces bundled in her lap, a large bronze bowl, much repaired, a comb, a snip of a silver coin, 3 trader's weights, 2 stirrups, 2 bridle's bits, and spikes to ride a horse on the ice, along with the bones of 2 horses, a stallion, and a mare. Of her clothing, all that remains are an iron cloak pin, a filigreed silver cone, 4 baubles or buttons of coiled silver wire, strips of silk embroidered with silver, and a scattering of mirrored sequins. Until 2017, when DNA tests proved the bones were female, this grave, numbered BJ581, was held up as the classic Viking warrior's grave. Quote, "The position of the skeleton," wrote a Swedish archaeologist in 1966, "gave the impression that he had been sitting in the grave rather than laid out. The equipment indicates that this is a warrior's grave rather than that of a merchant. The date of a silver coin found underneath the skeleton of the dead man provides a fairly good idea of the date of the grave, 913 to 980 AD. The implications of the dead man turning into a dead woman dazzle me. They ignite my imagination. A burial with weapons and horses, an archaeologist claimed as late as 2008, used, quote, "a widely recognized symbolic language of lordship, one that was unquestionably masculine." To assume that all such weapons graves are male now seems to me to be a mistake, one that has skewed our image of the Viking Age. How does history change if we turn that assumption on its head? There are other ways to interpret the grave, other ways to explain a female body buried with weapons, but the simplest seems to me the most likely. Defending their findings in 2019, the team that tested her DNA said BJ581, quote, "suggests to us that at least one Viking Age woman adopted a professional warrior lifestyle." They added, "We would be very surprised if she was alone in the Viking world." So that's the beginning of The Real Valkyrie.
And it is just, I mean, that beginning just sets my imagination on fire too. I'm sure a lot of readers are going to have the same reaction. You just describe it so beautifully. And I think what grabs us all is this idea
Mm-hmm.
that she's not the only one, as they say. And
Yeah.
what was so amazing about what you do in this book is that you really focus on how she was not an outlier. And you show us how her life might have intersected with those of a lot of other powerful women in the Viking Age, like Queen Gunnhild, the Red Girl, Queen Olga of Kyiv. And so I'm really curious, why do you think there were so many powerful women thriving during the 10th century?
I would actually ask that question in reverse. Why are there no more powerful women after the 10th century? You yourself have written about two very powerful women in 6th century France, in the Dark Queens, which I was very lucky to see in manuscript. When I look at the year 1000, I see a big sea change. That was the year that the northern world, the Norse people, became Christian, pretty much around the year 1000. In Europe, it was the year that the church began changing its focus. And one of my other books, called The Abacus and the Cross, is the story of the Pope in the year 1000. And he actually was the leading scientist and astronomer of his time. 30 years after his death, he was demonized as a warlock, a sorcerer, for having studied science. So there was this big change in what the church considered to be important, how popes were allowed to, how they were allowed to be around the year 1000. For the next 200 to 300 years, the Christian church became more hierarchical, more centralized, and focused on social control. They systematically reduced the opportunities for women by controlling marriage, by controlling who could inherit, by establishing ideas of legitimacy and ideas of incest that were really quite different than people knew and followed before the year 1000. So it's really hard for us to look back past that time and to see what life was like in the northern world in the pagan era, before they became Christian. And for me, that's the real Viking Age. The woman that I write about in The Real Valkyrie died well before the year 1000, probably around 965. And in her world, the ideas of what women could be were much different. They were not governed by Christian ideas of men versus women. So, for instance, if you look at Norse mythology, our best and sometimes our only source is a man named Snorri Sturluson, who's a 13th century Icelandic chieftain, whom I happen to write a biography of. That's my book, Song of the Vikings, so I know him really well. He's the one who gives us the standard definition of what a Valkyrie is, and he establishes them as beautiful goddesses, war goddesses, who take the fallen heroes from the battlefield and bring them to Valhalla and then serve them mead. So they're sort of like, helpers and rescuers and kitchen wenches. Convenient, yes. Well, Snorri is not a trustworthy source. He was a great writer. I really love reading his books, but he was a terrible misogynist, and he was awful to his daughters. I mean, he just used them for political gain. He also was, as I said, Christian, and he grew up in a society that had been Christian for 200 years. They no longer, worshipped any of the gods that he was writing about. Then you have to look at him as a writer. All writers have an audience in mind, and they have a purpose for writing. Well, Snorri's audience was a 16-year-old king of Norway who had been raised by and was controlled by bishops. Snorri's purpose was to get a good position in the Norwegian court. He wanted, to be the court poet, essentially. So when he wrote his book that includes what we know about Norse mythology, the Edda, he put a Christian slant on the stories he told. The women are like Mary or they're like Eve. They're either honored mothers or they're temptresses. And the goddesses are usually just objects of lust. However, in order to tell some stories, he has to give us glimpses of an earlier worldview. And one of these is in the Norse creation myth, which he does include in the Edda. And it goes like this. There were three gods wandering along the seashore, and they came across two logs of driftwood and decided to create humans out of the driftwood because they wanted somebody to worship them. So they shaped the wood into the shape of a man and a woman, and they brought them to life with blood, breath, and curious minds. Now, you compare this to the Christian creation myth. Adam is created in the image of God, but Eve is created from Adam's rib, sort of as an afterthought, because Adam is lonely and he wants to have somebody to help him get through life. In the Norse myth, the man, Asker, and the woman, Embla, are made at the same time, out of the same stuff, for the same reason, by the same gods. They are a team. And then you look at what they're made out of. The only difference is that the man is made out of ash wood, and ash wood is good for spear shafts and oars. And the woman is made out of an elm tree. And elm wood was used for wagon wheels and bows. So both of them have a role in killing and in transportation. And both woods can be used in peace and in war. So I think the same is likely true about the men and women of the Viking Age. They were different, they had different characteristics, but their role in the society was complementary. They were both needed, and they both had roles in both peace and war.
That is just fascinating. Wow.
Yeah, so that's how you can kind of, look back past the Christian influence on our sources and kind of, strip away the biases of, some of the sources that you're working with. But it does take some effort.
So I'm going to just jump ahead to a question I had since we're talking about Snorri.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a book about bias.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about the bias that you yourself faced in writing it or researching it. And now that you've written several books about women in the Viking Age, I'm thinking too of like The Far Traveler.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if like the tenor of the resistance you face has changed. Like, have you seen it? Is it receding? Is it kind of growing stronger? Is it wax and wane, given certain current events? Is there anything that you're willing to share about that?
Well, I have a real advantage in that I am not an academic. I am a full-time writer and I just write books. So as long as I can get a publisher, I don't have to worry about people telling me, you can't cross disciplines, or this is not how we do history, or, justify your use of sources. I just do it. For example, when I was writing The Far Traveler, I volunteered for 6 weeks on a dig in northern Iceland, where we actually dug up a house that was on the same farm where the woman known as Gudrid the Far Traveler lived when she came back from exploring North America. So this is a Viking woman who sailed from Iceland to Greenland to North America and back, and actually crossed the North Atlantic 8 times, according to the sagas. And here we have this house that was built at about the time that she came back to Iceland, right after the year 1000. And we're digging up this house and I'm going, oh my gosh, we found Gudrid's house. And the archaeologists are saying, Nancy, you can't say that. And I'm like, well, but I just did. And that book came out in 2007. And now my version of the story of Gudrid the Far Traveler is essentially the accepted one. I see it everywhere now. She was a leader. She was an explorer in her own right. She probably did live in that house in northern Iceland. When you go to the museum that's on the site of the house, they tell you she probably lived there. There's always a probably, there's always a qualifier, but that's accepted. So now I'm pushing farther and I'm arguing that Viking women could be warriors and war leaders. And in this case, I have really good science on my side because, we have this DNA study and a study of the bones that proves that this ultimate Viking warrior who since, the 1870s has been considered, a Viking war leader is a woman. And, the description of the grave hasn't changed. The understanding of the grave, the interpretation of the grave has been consistent for over 100 years. It's just one little bit of information has now changed that, oh, by the way, the person buried there is not male, she's female. So I was really surprised in 2017 when this paper came out. All of a sudden, there was this backlash from other scholars, from other archaeologists, from historians who study, Viking age women and Viking gender roles and things, saying, "Oh, you must have made a mistake because we know that warriors were men." And I'm going, "How do we know that? What am I not seeing here?" So that's what really sparked this book, was like, why are people against the idea that there really were women warriors, that they would say, oh, there must be something wrong with the science, when they're faced with what really was a very careful and well thought out study published in a major scientific journal with all the peer review that entails. And there's 10 people on the project. They didn't all make mistakes. So what I found out was that a lot of what we think we know about the Viking Age is actually assumptions that were made back in the 1800s by the first people who started Viking studies and archaeology at that time. Both disciplines arose during the Victorian era, when women were excluded from education. Women were not allowed to be scientists. Women were not really supposed to leave the house. They were to be concerned only with children, church, and kitchen, which is a wonderful, triad. So beginning in the 1830s, when graves were dug up, whether they were Viking Age or some other culture, if the grave had weapons in it, it was cataloged as male. And if the graves had jewelry in it, it was cataloged as female. And so we really don't have statistics on how many male and female burials do we have, because we've only based that on the objects you see in the grave. So a grave like BJ 581, where you have a female skeleton and all of the accoutrements of a male, is just inconceivable. They just don't know what to do with it, or they didn't until recently. Now we're sort of coming around to saying, yeah, we have to deal with the science, and using DNA is pretty revolutionary. I mean, the use of ancient DNA and being able to get good DNA and being able to learn things from it is a very new science. So it's understandable that they couldn't have done this in the 1950s or the 1970s or the 1990s, but we can do it now. So we have to accept that we're going to have to rethink a lot of things.
So do you think that, I'm assuming like each discovery makes it easier to like maybe, get the money to test other skeletons? I mean, are you expecting that there's going to be?
That's exactly, I mean, you put your finger right on it. To get the money to do it, because until recently it was extremely expensive, and you often didn't get any answer because the bones are 1,000 years old and they're degraded, and it's just really hard to get DNA out of them. And in fact, the group who did this study, they tested a whole lot more graves than just this one from Birka, because there were 1,100 graves dug up in the late 1800s in this Viking town of Birka. And all the bones were boxed and shipped to Stockholm, where they sat in the museum for over 100 years. And so this group of researchers was testing multiple graves to see what can we learn about the people here. So it's not just their gender, but also how old they were and what they ate, and did they have diseases, and bones can tell you lots of things. Well, very few of them gave them actually good DNA that they could sex. And it just so happened that this particular one not only gave them good DNA, but gave them really, really interesting and controversial results because nobody expected it to go that way. So now that that has happened, the same group of researchers and other people are going back and looking at other bones and saying, okay, well, let's test more of them. Let's test more of them. And since I stopped researching the topic, there's been at least 2 that have come out where in one case, people thought for a long time this must be a woman, and it turns out, yes, it is. And in another case, it's more difficult to interpret because her DNA didn't come out clearly female or male. It's somewhere in between. So that can happen. You know, it's a spectrum. So in BJ581, she's way over on the female side of the spectrum. But in this other grave that, I mean, I haven't read too much about it. It was just published in Finland. The DNA is sort of partly male and partly female. So we could have a transgender person there that is going to really make people, struggle over interpretation. Like, what do we know about gender roles in this society? So it's every time a new technology like this comes into a field, you're going to see revolutions, and that's pretty much what's happening here.
Just a quick follow-up. I think some of the participants might be interested in hearing just a tidbit about the teeth, because that's just the way, like, what you can know about someone who lived 1,000 years ago by their teeth.
Yeah. Well, essentially what I did when writing this book was I took the archaeology as, the basis for creating the character of, I called her Hervor, but the character of the person who was buried in this grave. So the first thing that the archaeology gives me is the chronology. And that's, as I said in the introduction, the coin that's in the grave gives you a broad chronology sometime in the 900s. The placement of the grave narrows that down and shows us that she was probably buried when the Warriors' Hall still existed, and that burned down around 965. So we have this end date of about 965. Her bones and her teeth tell us how old she was. We can tell that she was between 30 and 40 years old when she died. So that establishes our chronology sometime between 930 and 965. They also tell us that she ate well all her life. She didn't go through any periods of malnutrition or starvation, which in the mid 900s meant that she was probably very rich, or maybe even from royalty, because it was a rough time. She was also very tall for a woman of her time. She was 5'7", and there's a king of Denmark during her lifetime, King Gorm, who was considered tall at 5'8". So she was almost as tall as the tall king. About 5'5" was average for that time in the part of the world that she lived in. Her teeth also tell us, and this is really cool, that she wasn't born in the town of Birka, where she died. And Birka is on an island in the lake outside of Stockholm. So it's a couple hours boat ride from Stockholm. But she came from somewhere in southern Sweden or Norway, so near the Oslo fjord. And we know that because your teeth, when you are growing, take in the minerals from the water that you drink. And they can tell based on what kind of stone underlies the areas. They can tell in broadly geographical area that she came from. So she came from. Also know that when her molars were forming, she moved. So before she was 8, she moved farther west, and she might have even gone to the British Isles. She could have gone as far as Dublin. And she didn't get to Birka in Sweden near Stockholm until she was older than 16. So this was a young woman who traveled around. And that's rather interesting. We think, medieval people stayed in one place. Well, no, young Viking girls traveled around. And then there's the stuff in the grave that also helps tell the story. The weapons and the clothing have connections to the East Way, which is the Viking trade route from Sweden to the east through the Baltic Sea to Russia, down the Russian rivers to Constantinople and Baghdad, and even to the Silk Road. So there's some weapons that are more common on the East Way, and also this little silver, filigreed silver cone that was found. It actually was found right on top of the skull, like it was the tip of her cap. Very pretty little thing on the top of her cap. And that has an exact match in a grave in Kiev. So the archaeology allows her to travel from Dublin to Kiev, and gives us the date, 930 to 965, when she could have lived. And then to add to that, I reread histories and medieval histories and sagas and poetry, and I found the people who were living around her in all these places, and who might she have met, and what was their lives like.
Let's talk about that a little bit more if we can, because one of the things that I think makes this book so extraordinary and such a real treat is that you handle the archaeology and the hard science very deftly, but you also use all of these fictional techniques that a lot of readers might be surprised to really flesh out what her life could have been like. And I'm wondering if you can talk about maybe what influenced that decision to kind of go there. And also, I'm really curious about how, like, your background, because you've got this background in literature, but also in science, and how that informed sort of the structure of this book.
I was one of those students in college who couldn't make up my mind. So I did a degree in English with a specialization in medieval literature, but also in science. And then as soon as I graduated, I got a job full-time as a science writer for a university magazine, which was a wonderful education, writing about science in all different fields. So I'm very comfortable reading the technical papers and talking to scientists. But at the same time, I discovered the Icelandic sagas. And so I went on for a graduate degree in comparative literature, looking at medieval literature, and Icelandic sagas was something that I continued studying on my own and visiting Iceland and that sort of thing at the same time as I was working as a science writer. So I had this 2-track life going on where I was doing literature and sagas and medieval stuff and writing about science. So it makes a lot of sense to me to put the stories and the science together. Now, can you do that in a nonfiction book? Well, in all my previous books, I've used both of these sources. I've used the medieval text and the modern archaeology, but usually the story, for instance, in The Far Traveler, was the story of me finding out stuff. That was the plot of that book. And in, Ivory Vikings, I was using the archaeology just sort of to back up stories that were in the sagas. Well, in this one, I wrote a first draft that was like that, where I told stories out of the sagas about valkyries and shield-maids and powerful women, and I described the science, and I showed what the world was like and who was living where and everything. And I turned it in to my editor, and we both felt that the Valkyrie, BJ 581, still was in the shadows. She never sort of came to the focus of the book. She was just sort of a mystery. And so, I'm talking to my editor, it's like, well, the deadline is passed and I don't know how much time I have to revise, but I'd really like to do more. And then my editor said, well, guess what? You can have another year because COVID has upset all of our publishing schedules. And she says, I was going to have to tell you, we were going to have to delay this book for 6 months, at least 6 months anyway. So if you want another year, you can have it. And so I took the COVID year to rethink how to present the story, because I already had all the material and all the research done and pretty much knew what I wanted to say. And that's when I realized that when people do documentaries now, you often have them interviewing experts, and then they'll cut away and they'll have a reenactment scene where they'll actually hire actors to show you what it might have been like. And in fact, in 2018, a documentary filmmakers from Iceland did a film on the far traveler, about the woman Gudrid the far traveler, and interviewed me as one of the experts. And when I saw what they put together, they had done that. They had created the scenes, they had hired the actors. And I said, wow, I really like that way of telling the story. Why don't I do that? You know, why don't I just write some of it in a style of historical fiction, as if it's a reenactment? And so I ran that past my editor, and she said, fantastic, go with it. I mean, I really thought she was going to shoot this down. I said, yeah, can you still sell it as history? And she says, absolutely. Well, you just need to make clear when you are changing genres. So that's when I took like my first draft and divided, 9 chapters up into like 48 different pieces and shuffled things and said, okay, which parts of this can I tell better as fiction? And created the story of Hervor and the people she meets. And it was very important to me that the reader's not going to be confused, that you always know when you are in a fictional scene and when you are out of it. So I have 2 very different voices, and we even worked with the typography to make it clear. So it's sort of like there's a fictional scene at the beginning of every chapter, and then I step back and I talk about my sources and what's fact and what's speculation and whatever. And one of my friends who read a draft of it said, wow, this is like a masterclass in how to write historical fiction, because you say, this is how you should use your sources. And I thought, wow, I kind of like that.
And like, speaking of your sources, I'm really curious about, especially after writing this, like, what do you think counts as a historical source? And the reason I'm fascinated by this is because I'm thinking of all of these texts that we admit have exaggerations and half-truths, and maybe there's dragons, but like, people have spent millions of dollars looking for King Arthur, right? I mean, we have no evidence that
right.
but there are, we're going to find him. Or I'm thinking of things like the Bible, where we say, well, okay, we don't buy everything in there, but let's look for the scenes of sites of specific battles or events. And so I'm really curious about why you think the Norse sagas haven't been treated in this way, when it seems like a lot of the things that are in there are being proven through science to have some fact.
Well, there's 2 ways of answering this. First, if you're interested in the Middle Ages and you want to use any sources, written sources from the Middle Ages, you're going to find dragons. I'm not kidding. There are dragons in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. There are dragons in the driest and most boring annals, and so you're never going to actually get away from the fabulous. If you don't have dragons, you're going to have miracles, of saints and that kind of thing. So it's like almost impossible to find a source from that time period that would be what we consider realistic, all the way through. So you have to know how to judge when you're reading a text, what is historical, what could be historical, what's plausible, and what you can obviously ignore. So the dragons, the ghosts, a lot of the sorcery, though, that kind of is how people looked at the world. Yeah, that sort of stuff you can set to one side. But everything that is written is a historical source, because it reflects the writer's time and the writer's viewpoint and the writer's biases. It tells us something about what people believed was true at that time, or what people enjoyed reading at that time. So you can find history in any kind of text, whether it's poetry, whether it's a saga, whether it's an annal, by how you read it. You just have to learn to identify the assumptions behind the writing, which is like the example I gave of trying to read the Norse creation myth in Snorri's version. There's things that he he couldn't leave out about mythology and that tell us stuff that he didn't believe, but we can learn, something that he doesn't think he's telling us. So when you're looking at the Icelandic sagas and the Norse myths, you have to remember that these were written in the 1200s, and they're talking about people that lived 200 to 400 years before that time. So it's like historical fiction when it was written. They don't know any of these people personally. They don't believe in the old gods anymore. There are a few sagas that actually are set in the current time, so we can see the difference between when they're writing about their own times and when they're writing about Viking Age. But it's always a matter of interpretation, how you read these. And for hundreds of years, saga scholars have debated this question, whether they're history, whether they're fiction, how much is history, how much is fiction. We're going to continue debating that forever. But the archaeologists are giving us these data points where they're finding houses and churches and graveyards in places that the sagas say they were at a certain time, and the dates fit. And it's very hard not to put two and two together and say, this is, Gudrid's house, or this is, Theodhild's church. So the archaeologists are kind of pushing for more use of the sagas. And there are certain of them that are really at the head of their field who are pushing this harder than others. So I think the shift is happening now to read the sagas more as a historical source, and also even to look at the mythology and the poetry as a historical source for what it can tell us about the archaeology. And when you look at the two of them together, they have a conversation going. They tell you things that one source by itself can't tell you. So that's really how it's developing. And for me, what I really want to make clear is, when I'm writing, especially in the Real Valkyrie, that the reader knows what is an actual fact. I mean, there's a fact that there were bones and weapons found in this grave. What's fiction is that I give her a name, Hervor, and have her go on this, have her meet people who lived at the same time that she may or may not have met. What is speculation? What is my assumption? I'm really writing more of an argument than, a textbook. I'm pushing this idea as far as I can, because I'm interested, as I said in the introduction, in how history changes when we change our assumptions. So the assumption has always been the warriors were all men. And so I wanted to take, okay, so let's assume that some of the warriors are women. What changes?
So I know we're going to open it up to audience questions in a moment, but I wonder if I can in one more very quick question, which is, there's so much that's surprising about this book for all of us reading it. And I know obviously you were working with the data, the science, the sagas for so long, but was there anything in here that truly just floored even you, that really surprised you?
Well, I think what surprised me the most was that, we've had this discussion about the sagas being used as historical sources, and people usually are thinking about what the subgenre that's called the sagas of Icelanders, or the Icelandic family sagas, because when you read them, they seem really realistic. I mean, this is about the people who settled Iceland in the Viking Age, and sometimes they left Iceland to go on Viking raids, and they got involved with the kings of Norway and things like this. But there's a whole other group of sagas that are usually just sort of pushed to the side. And these are the sagas of ancient times. And I had always overlooked them because I'd been told they're like so unrealistic. They're just full of dragons and trolls and women warriors. So obviously they can't be true. And I started reading them, and I was surprised to find how realistic some of these scenes in these sagas were, if you accept the idea that there were women warriors. For instance, there's this one really great battle scene where there's a woman warrior who is in charge of a fortress, of a fortified town. And it's always been considered just complete fantasy because as we all know, there were no fortified towns in the Viking Age. This is a later medieval idea. Well, research in the town of Birka in Sweden, where the grave comes from that I've written about, over the last 20 years, shows that the town of Birka was a fortified town. And it matches the description in this saga almost exactly, with the earthen ramparts and the wooden walls and the archers on top of the walls and the stakes and the rocks in the harbor to protect it, and the beacons on the offshore islands so that they can tell when the enemy is coming. And even the strategy that is explained in this saga, where the woman warrior named Thorbjorg, they're about to be overrun because the invading army has dug underneath the walls, which is an obvious way to do it, and they're going to break through. And so she says, okay, she gets the townspeople together and she says, package up all your valuables and leave them in the middle of the floor. Put food out on the table, put wine out, put ale out. And then we're all going to run out through the escape tunnel into the woods. And the warriors and I will regroup, come back in while the enemy is eating and drinking and fighting over who's going to get what, valuable object and this sort of thing. And we will stand up on the top of the walls with our bows and arrows and pick them off. And this is exactly the strategy that the town of Birka was designed for. And that the archaeologists can put together based on the weapons they find there, the design of the walls, the design of the gates and like the secret tunnels and all this kind of stuff is at Birka. So this saga could actually be describing Birka, and it's just been written off as total fantasy because we all know there are towns like that didn't exist. It's just, no, we hadn't dug it up yet. We didn't know. So that's the kind of thing that I found really fascinating, was when a source has been dismissed as like just completely unbelievable, is now believable because we have new information from archaeology.
That's just unbelievable. I love that. Yeah. I mean, and it's so interesting, this like failure of imagination on the part
Absolutely.
of the science community to think of like what other things have been overlooked.
Yeah.
I was also just so captured by the fact it's a minor little note, but one thing that really grabbed my attention, as I was saying here, was that her skull is missing, and like, so it could be sitting somewhere in someone's collection, right? Like some Victorian.
The archaeologist who I talked to, she explained that unfortunately in the late 1800s, it was very common for skulls to be put into a separate collection, and that archaeologists, scientists like to trade, so that you would trade a skull from Sweden for a skull from Finland or whatever, so that you'd have a complete set. And so they're trying to trace it, and they might actually be able to because of the DNA, but so far it hasn't turned up. They have the bottom jaw, which is great because they have enough teeth that they can study, but the top of her skull is missing and has been missing for a long time.
Wow. I mean, that's just thrilling. Is there anything else? Oh, here we go, Sam. I was going to say, any questions I'm wondering too from the audience, or anything that you'd like to chime in with?
Well, let's just see what the questions are from the audience. Sam, do you want to handle that? Thanks, Shelley.
So thank you to both of you. This has been absolutely fascinating to listen to. And, it makes me think as you're talking about sources that really are from popular culture of the time, what future archaeologists may turn to determine the story of the 2020s. It will be fascinating to see. But we won't see it, but someone will. That just interests me on such a deep level. I think that probably a lot of readers will be sucked in by that. if you have questions for Nancy Marie Brown, please do drop them into the chat or into the Q&A box. It's at the bottom of your screen, just as Q&A. You can type your question in there, and we would be happy to get to as many as we can before the end of the hour. Nancy, one thing that I found myself wondering about was, we talked a little bit about how you select sagas and select the sources that you are looking at. And we had talked a little bit before the broadcast started about going into library collections, but do you have a favorite saga, and what do you look for in sagas and other like primary sources like that to determine if they're something that can be extrapolated from?
I have a different favorite saga depending on what project I'm working on, and it goes back and forth. Some of them I have read many times. Some of them, like this one that has the women warriors in it, I just read for the first time for this book. I mean, for this book, I specifically looked at sagas that had events taking place in the time period of between 930 and 965, or that had women fighters. So I was looking both for, people that this skeleton, whom I've named Hervor, might have met, and people who are like her in the stories. So I named her Hervor because there is a saga called the Saga of Hervor, or in one translation, the Saga of King Hrethric the Wise. And the person who translated the saga decided that Hervor was really not the important enough to be the title character of this saga. It was really about her son, King Hrethric. So, right away, we have this bias coming in where the medieval title of the saga is pushed aside because she couldn't possibly be important enough to have a saga about her. We're going to make the saga be about her son, who does really get a lot of space in the saga, probably more than she does. But this character of Hervor has always been one of my favorites because the saga includes poems that are much older than the saga. So we know that her story was one of the oldest ones told in the Norse world. It was one of the ones that was preserved for the longest time. And this is the story of a young woman who doesn't want to sit at home and do embroidery. She doesn't want to learn how to weave. She goes out and practices with her bow and arrow. She goes out and learns to use all the weapons. When she's told that she really has to, start behaving like a woman and get married, she runs away. She joins a Viking band. She becomes the leader of the band. And she has learned that her father was a Viking warrior and that he was buried on a certain island in Denmark, and that the family heirloom sword was buried with him. And so she goes with her Viking band and she wants to dig up his grave and get the sword back. And the other Vikings in her crew are afraid to do this because the graveyard is haunted. Every night it bursts into flames, the dead rise, and it's this wonderful spooky scene. And in fact, this poem that's in the saga that describes this has sometimes been considered the inspiration for the Gothic novel. When it first came into English, people always like looking at this as the inspiration for spookiness. And so Hervor goes by herself, takes the rowboat out of the Viking ship, goes to the island, and decides she's going to open her father's grave. Now, in the poem, she does this sort of magically. It just kind of opens by itself, and there's this great scene where she's debating with her father whether she should get the sword or not. And the question is not, is she a good enough warrior? And the question is not that women shouldn't have swords. The question is, this sword is cursed, and it's going to end their family line. And would she do that to her family? Would she end her family line by taking this sword out of the grave? And she says, yes, I would. I don't plan to have any children. I'm a warrior. And so in the end, her father is forced to give up the sword. And she declares at that point I would rather have this than be the king of Norway. And it's like this wonderful line that makes you think, wow, a young woman actually could be the king of Norway. And so anyway, there's this strong female warrior woman. And then there's even a second one in this book who's also named Hervor. So that was why I chose that name for the fictional character in my book, was to honor this ultimate Viking warrior woman who, we've known and loved in this poem for hundreds of years. This is actually the first Viking poem that was ever translated into English. And it's sort of, where we got the idea that, Vikings laugh in the face of danger, because she just laughs at her father when the ghost rises up out of the grave and she says, you can't scare me. Come on, give me the sword.
We had a question going back to you were talking about warrior women. Someone asks, what's the difference between a shield maiden in the sagas and your warrior women? Can you talk about that a little bit?
That's a good question. The first thing I would say is I don't call them shield maidens, because maiden seems to involve virginity, and their sexual experience had nothing to do with this. The word used for men of the same status was boy, drengr. So these are the professional warriors who are not married, who have no duty to family, and who have renounced their kinship ties or their honor ties to their family. The shield maids and the drengr were forbidden to marry. If they did, they had to leave the war band. In the sagas and in the poetry, the word shield maid and the word Valkyrie are used interchangeably. The idea that there is a difference between them is something that scholars have come up with in the 20th, 19th, and 20th century. And it's basically this modern urge that we have to classify things and put things in boxes. This was not something that people did in the medieval period. So a shield maid can also be a Valkyrie can also be a shield maid. Either one of them can be a giantess or an elf or a human woman. So it's very flexible and very, frangible. And so I just decided I'm a lumper, not a splitter. So Valkyrie is all of them. I define Valkyrie as any female with a weapon. So I'm including giantesses, I'm including, human-like and goddess-like characters in the sources. So I'm using Valkyrie pretty much to get everyone who was female with a weapon.
Thank you. We're coming close to the end of our time together. And if you do have additional questions for Nancy, do drop them in the chat or drop them in the Q&A. But I did want to ask a little bit about Shelley Puhak. You have a new book coming in February of 22, and this is a book that Nancy has read and enjoyed. And I wondered if you could tell us just a little bit about it as well.
Oh, sure. Thanks so much. I actually finally have proofs in hand. So I was like, I have a cover. But one thing that's a fascinating sort of intersection is my way into discovering about these two long overlooked medieval queens actually was through Norse legend, coincidentally, just an aside mention. But essentially Brunhild, the character Brunhild, who goes on to, we see her feature as a character in Wagner's opera and in all sorts of sort of pop culture and literature, is based on the lives of these two queens who were sisters-in-law. And in the middle of the 6th century, they ruled most of Western Europe, and their story was purposely erased. So it was really interesting for me to kind of see how this plays out maybe a few hundred years sort of past their reigns. in a lot of the Norse legends as well. So it was a great sort of serendipitous intersection with Nancy's work.
I wonder if both of you are clearly readers and people who are collecting a lot of research and a lot of lore. I wonder if we could just do a flash round. Can you tell me further reading beyond your books? What would you recommend for learning more about this period and the subject?
Well, for the subject matter, I would like to recommend the book by Pamela Toller called Women Warriors, An Unexpected History. And she looks at women warriors, Valkyries, from the earliest times to today. And she finds thousands of women in all cultures, in all times, across the world who fought. And she really destroys this concept that all the warriors were men. I mean, she really just takes it apart. So that was a big influence on me.
Nancy would be the expert for the Viking era, but a few other books that come to mind certainly would be like Kara Cooney's When Women Ruled the World, which is really fascinating to show that this fact of like female reign being erased really like goes back just thousands and thousands of years, and there are a lot of women warriors and women leaders from the beginning of time.
Oops, I'm muted. Well, thank you to both of you. We are just about out of time here, and I wish I could just sit and listen to the two of you talk all night. This has been really fascinating. Those of you who have been watching and if your interest is piqued, I can't recommend highly enough that you pick up The Real Valkyrie. We do have copies of this book. It's just out from St. Martin's Press. We've got copies available at the Norwich Bookstore. If you're in the Upper Valley area, I hope we'll have you stop in and pick one up off the shelves. And if you would like to order one from us, if you're from further afield, we'd be happy to ship you a book. There's a link in the chat. You can go ahead and click on that, or anytime just visit our website, norwichbookstore.com. You can search the book up, and we will ship it to you, USPS Media Mail or another expedited source of your choice. And thank you again for supporting independent bookstores. It's what allows us to keep doing what we're doing. And again, pre-order Shelley Puhak's The Dark Queens. I'm looking forward to seeing a copy of that one as well. And you can also pick up other books by Nancy Marie Brown and Shelley Puhak on our website, norwichbookstore.com. And do follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter. You'll see other things that we've got going on as well. And like I say, there's sure to be something else that you will enjoy. So I hope we'll see you back here in this digital space, and someday in the real world as well, when we'll gather again in our store to welcome authors. Nancy Marie Brown, Shelley Puhak, thank you both so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
And all of you out there, thank you from wherever you are. Do good work, read good books, be safe, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much for joining us.
Bye.